So what comes to your mind when you think of someone from Boston? Is it a guy that looks like this, a woman who looks like this, or this half-dog, half-dolphin hybrid with an iced coffee from Dunk's? Well, I'm here to tell you that yes, you can find them in Boston, including the last one. But the city is a lot more diverse than movies starring Mark Wahlberg, Ben Affleck, and Matt Damon's show. Good Will Hunting or The Departed might make Boston seem pretty white, and that's par for the course in Hollywood, where only 3 out of 10 roles in top movies go to actors of color, according to a University of California Hollywood Diversity report. But while Boston used to be a very white city, in 1970 about 70% of its population was white, according to the Boston Redevelopment Authority, as of today only 45% of Boston is white, which makes it a majority-minority city. Lifelong Bostonian Dart Adams is a journalist and author who recently wrote an op-ed for Boston Magazine on how Boston's diversity is misrepresented in media. And he's tired of seeing a false narrative pushed in movies and television.
Every time I think about it, there's film, television, media centered in Boston and Massachusetts, and it always centers white people and never the people who actually live in the city, or excludes them completely from the experience. It doesn't tell the stories of the towns and cities in Massachusetts that are overwhelmingly Black and Latino.
And this exclusion makes actual Bostonians who are people of color feel overlooked.
Everybody sticks with this idea of what Boston is or isn't, and what that means is that I and other Bostonians who look like me and have the background experience I do instantly erased, and we're not part of the Boston, ideal. We're not authentic Bostonians because my voice sounds like this as opposed to me talking about parking the car to have a job.
And diversity is something we want, says Luke Schuster, director of Boston Indicators, a research center at the Boston Foundation that focuses on data-driven research to overcome the area's biggest challenges. He thinks it's the key to our success.
Diversity is really core to what makes cities great. It makes our neighborhoods vibrant and interesting. Having a range of people with different perspectives and experiences makes the local economy much more vibrant, leads to innovation.
According to the U.S. Census, there are just under 700,000 people living in Boston. That population is 23% Black or African American, 20% Hispanic or Latino, 10% Asian, 2.4% 2 or more races, and 0.3% American Indian or Pacific Islander. Boston Indicators uses a diversity index to more accurately measure diversity, essentially measuring the chance that 2 people selected from the population will be diverse. For instance, in racial diversity or age, Boston has a diversity index of about 70%.
And that's a really striking number. Boston doesn't have a reputation for being that racially diverse. I think that's just a perception that lags behind reality.
Other cities may seem more diverse because a minority group makes up a larger portion of the population. For example, San Antonio is over 60% Latino, but does not have the racial mix that Boston has. Out of the city's population, 72% were born in the US and 28% are from abroad. Of that group, about half are naturalized US citizens and half aren't US citizens. People of color, Afro-Caribbean, Latino, and Asian, are fueling population growth in Greater Boston these past few decades, while the white population has dropped by almost 350,000. Between 1990 and 2017, the Latino population grew by 191%, while the Asian American population grew by 227%. And we see diversity within these broad groups when it comes to immigration.
Just within the broad Asian category, you have Vietnamese immigrants, a range of new Chinese immigrants. You have very different types of people moving here from China. Lower income folks who have lower levels of education, and others coming on worker visas to work in our tech sector.
Language is often an important consideration for immigrants. Just under 2/3 of people in Boston speak only English at home, while a total of 37.7% of people in the city speak other languages at home, some exclusively. Other than English, Spanish is the most spoken language in Boston homes, followed by Haitian or French, Chinese, Portuguese or Cape Verdean Creole, and then Vietnamese. Luke cautioned that while it may be great that Boston is so diverse, that's not enough. Equity remains a problem. Is the city doing enough?
One issue that's persistent both within the city of Boston and across the region, is residential and also school-based segregation. So just because a range of people with different racial and ethnic backgrounds may be living in the same municipality doesn't necessarily mean that they are interacting with each other and going to school together.
Equity's been a major focus of Boston's previous mayor, Marty Walsh, and the current mayor, Kim Janey, who's the first woman and first person of color to serve in the role.
We know that we still have a lot of work to do to make these dreams real for everyone in our city.
If you've ever tried to look for an apartment or, God forbid, a home in the Boston area, you know that there's a big gap in housing that needs to be addressed in the city.
The type of sort of modest multifamily housing stock that Boston's known for, things like the triple-decker, are actually banned by a lot of local zoning codes. So it's also going to be important to pair that with significant public investments in housing subsidies for lower income families.
A housing gap changes the landscape of a city. Boston public schools have seen a decline in enrollment while the total population has increased. All these young professionals, when they want to have kids, they move out to the suburbs to find a place they can afford. And you people who might be thinking about having kids, millennials and Gen Z are dominant right now in Boston. 35% of the population is between the ages of 20 and 34. Most of the rest of the city is 35 and older, while younger than 20 is the smallest group. Side note, US Census data shows that it's ladies' night and day and, well, all the time in Boston, because there are more women in Boston than men. 52% of the population has 2 X chromosomes. Back to housing. This exodus from the city is also seen in minority communities, creating some new dynamics in the surrounding region.
More accessible suburbs like Quincy, Malden, Brockton that have seen really rapid increases in the communities of color living there. And in those places, it's often either new immigrants sort of skipping ever moving to the city in the first place, or middle-class communities of color moving out of the urban core in order to buy their first home.
Luke said that Brockton has seen a major influx of first-time homebuyers who are African American, more than in the entire city, creating a growing black middle class south of Boston. Another interesting tidbit on housing. Luke said that the coronavirus pandemic, awful as it is, might actually present a unique opportunity for housing at the cost of business in the city.
If some meaningful portion of businesses or offices never reopen in the urban core, you could imagine some of that space being repurposed for much needed housing in Boston, and that could help moderate housing prices and allow some of the middle class to consider moving back into the city.
Speaking of universities, there's a lot of college grads in Boston. Among people 25 and older, almost half have a bachelor's degree or higher. 18% have some college or associate's degree, 20% are high school graduates, and 13% did not graduate high school. Boston has also attracted many black teachers. More than half of the African American teachers in the entire state of Massachusetts are teaching in Boston public schools. Of course, the students being taught in Boston look much different in reality than they do on screen.
Movies like, Fever Pitch, where he's a teacher and you look at the classroom and who are the students in the classroom, and the fact of the matter is that Boston public schools are less than 15% white.
According to Luke, while you can have a diverse population, representation in leadership is key to addressing concerns across multiple communities in the area, and trends are moving towards more diversity in Boston politics.
The political and business leadership in those communities has really lagged behind in comparison to the racial diversity on the ground. So that's another real challenge we need to work on. The city council in Boston is more racially and gender diverse than it's ever been in its history. The mayor's race that's happening right now, at least currently, there's not even a single white candidate running for office. So it seems very likely that the permanent next mayor of Boston will be someone who's non-white.
So Boston is diverse and trending to become even more diverse in the coming years. So how can Hollywood and television better represent this city?
What needs to happen is the people who greenlight, who produce films, television, and media about Boston need to make a concerted effort to find creators, writers, showrunners who are of color and from the region to write stories about their experiences here, and to take them and put them out in the forefront, like greenlight this, get this made.
Finally, one thing that is not always on the forefront of the diversity conversation is the growing multiracial population, which is a growing diversity factor in cities like Boston.
Families themselves are forming across racial and ethnic lines. Roughly 10% of young kids living in Boston today actually have multiple racial identities and are the product of two parents coming together across racial and ethnic lines. In a lot of the data sources that track racial identification don't track multiracial data well or at all, so there's even a limitation to our knowledge really here.
So Boston is probably more diverse than you thought, but still has a long way to go to make it a city made for everyone, like the American melting pot filled with simmering hot Boston clam chowder. I'd watch that movie.